Hello everyone, I'm MANO and
And I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you're from and what time you're watching this. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. My name is Tyler Brooks. What I'm about to write down happened last September at the Game Lodge campground in Custer State Park, South Dakota, and I still don't have a clean way to explain it. I've told the short version to a few people. My mother, my therapist, a South Dakota game warden who took notes and never called me back. And every time I tell it, it sounds smaller than it was. So I'm writing the long version once, for myself, and then I don't think I'll tell it again. I need to start with Danny, because none of the rest of it makes sense without him. In 2009, when I was 20 and he was 17, my brother went on a Boy Scout backcountry trip into the Black Hills, somewhere off the Centennial Trail near Mount Coolidge. He never came back. There was a search, dogs, helicopters, volunteers walking grid lines for 11 days. And then there wasn't a search anymore, just a case number and a photo that stopped aging while the rest of us kept going. My parents split up 2 years later. I stopped saying his name out loud sometime around then, not because I forgot him, but because saying it made people's faces do something I couldn't stand to watch. I hadn't been back to South Dakota since. My wife, Dana, knew the outline of it. Brother, camping trip, never found. But not the weight of it, because I'd never let her carry the weight of it. Dana is a physical therapist, precise and unsentimental in a way I've always needed. She doesn't do well with things that don't resolve. Neither do I, which is probably why we work. The trip was my idea, and it was a bad one, though it took me a long time to admit that to myself. I told Dana and our friend Marcus that I wanted to rent an RV and do 2 weeks through the northern plains, Badlands, the Black Hills, maybe up into the Bighorns if we had time. What I didn't say, not clearly, was that I wanted to end up in Custer State Park on the anniversary week of Danny's disappearance, in the same general country where he'd vanished, and see what that felt like after 15 years. I told myself it was closure. I didn't examine the word very hard. Marcus had known me since college and had never met Danny, which made him easy to be around on that trip in a way Dana sometimes wasn't. He didn't have the history, so he didn't watch me for cracks. He was the kind of friend who filled silences with bad jokes, which I'd always been grateful for. Except that trip, near the end, there weren't any more jokes in him. We rented a 31-foot Class C from a place outside Rapid City and drove into Custer State Park on a Tuesday in the second week of September. Game Lodge campground sits along French Creek, ringed by ponderosa pine. Ordinary in every way a campground is ordinary. Gravel loops, numbered sites, a camp store that sold firewood and ice cream, a bathhouse with a squeaky screen door. We checked in a little after 4 in the afternoon. The woman at the registration window told us the park's bison herd had been unusually active near the wildlife loop that week, and to keep our windows up if we saw them close to the road. That was the only warning anybody gave us, and it wasn't the one that mattered. Our site was 31 near the back of the C loop, backed up against a tree line that thickened into national forest beyond a low, split-rail fence. Site 30 was empty. Site 32 had a truck camper in it, older couple, Iowa plates, gone most days before we woke up. And then there was Site 14, catty corner across the loop road, which is where I should start actually telling you what happened, because that's where the wrongness started in the smallest possible way, before it was wrongness at all. The first night, after we'd leveled the RV and gotten the awning out and eaten grilled corn off the little camp stove, Dana noticed the light in Site 14 was still on well past midnight. That's nothing. People run their generators, leave a porch light burning, whatever. What she actually said, lying next to me in the cramped overcab bed, was, "Someone's humming over there." I hadn't heard it. I told her it was probably a radio. "It's not a song," she said. "It's just up and down, like someone practicing a note." I fell asleep before she did. In the morning, she didn't bring it up again, and neither did I, because in the light of a normal camp morning, Marcus frying eggs, somebody's dog barking 2 loops over, the particular metallic smell of a propane stove, it seemed like nothing worth discussing. That's something I want to be honest about in this account. Almost none of it seemed like anything, one piece at a time. It only adds up if you already know how it ends. Site 14 had an RV in it, a older fifth wheel, tan and brown, the kind that's been through a few owners. We never once, in 5 days, saw anyone come out of it during daylight. The awning was never extended. There was no truck or car parked beside it that I ever saw. No dog, no folding chairs, no laundry hung to dry. None of the small debris that accumulates around a camp in use. Just the trailer sitting there, and at night, a light behind the curtained window. And, according to Dana, and eventually me too, a sound that might have been humming, or might have been something else entirely, low enough that you could talk yourself out of having heard it at all. On day 2, we did the tourist things. We drove the wildlife loop and saw the bison, close enough that Marcus rolled his window down halfway to get a picture, and Dana yelled at him to roll it back up. We hiked a short trail near Sylvan Lake. It was a good day, genuinely. The kind of day I'd wanted the trip to have more of. That night, back at the campground, I built a fire, and that's when the second small wrong thing happened. The fire wouldn't catch clean. I'm not talking about anything dramatic. I mean the kindling smoked and smoldered and refused to take for almost 20 minutes, which, given how dry everything was that week, given that we'd bought a bundle of kiln-dried split oak from the camp store that afternoon, didn't make sense. When it did finally catch, it burned with an edge of blue at the base of the flame that I noticed and didn't mention, because Marcus was talking about something else and I didn't want to seem like the guy who narrates his own campfire. Copper does that sometimes, in old nails or treated wood. I told myself it was that. I still don't know if it was that. We sat around the fire and Marcus told a story about a co-worker's disastrous camping trip, and Dana laughed in the specific way she laughs when she's decided to enjoy herself despite something nagging at her. And across the loop road, Site 14's light was on, and I watched it for longer than I should have without really deciding to. Day 3 is when we met the ranger. We'd driven up toward Mount Coolidge in the late morning, not on purpose, or not entirely on purpose. I told Dana and Marcus I wanted to see the fire lookout tower at the summit, which was true, but I also knew, the way you know a thing you're not saying out loud, that the search grid for Danny 15 years ago had run through that same drainage. I hadn't told either of them that part. I'm not proud of that. The GPS on my phone glitched on the way up. Not dramatically. It didn't send us off a cliff or anything you'd put in a movie. It just froze twice, the little blue dot sitting motionless on a road we were clearly still driving on, and once, for about 90 seconds, it showed us on a road that didn't match anything visible out the windshield, a straight gray line cutting through green where there should have been the switchback curve we were actually on. I chalked it up to bad signal. The Black Hills eat cell service. Everyone who's ever been there will tell you that. At the base of the lookout access road, a park ranger was parked in a green pickup, doing something with a clipboard. He waved us down, friendly enough, and asked where we were headed. Middle-aged, sun-weathered name tag that said Ostrander. I told him the lookout tower, and he nodded and said it was a nice walk, then asked, almost as an aside, if we were staying at Game Lodge. I said we were. Site 31, Dana added, because she's more comfortable with strangers than I am. He wrote something on his clipboard I couldn't see, and then he said something that I turned over in my head for the rest of the day. You folks been over by 14 at all? Just, if you see anybody moving in and out of that unit, radio the camp host. That trailer's supposed to be empty this week. I asked him what he meant. He said the site had been reserved and then the reservation had been canceled. Some paperwork mix-up. But the trailer itself hadn't been towed out yet. Some issue with the owner not answering calls. And in the meantime, the park didn't want people going in and out of a unit that wasn't checked in. Routine stuff, he said. Property issue, nothing to worry about. But there had been a light on. There had been humming. I didn't say that to him. I don't fully know why I didn't. I think some part of me had already decided I didn't want an official explanation that would flatten the strangeness into a paperwork error. Because the strangeness, at that point, was still interesting to me in a way I'm ashamed of now. I wanted the trip to have an edge to it. I had spent 15 years being the guy whose brother vanished into these hills, and some ugly, unexamined part of me wanted to feel close to that mystery again, even a manufactured minor version of it. Before he drove off, Ostrander looked at me a beat longer than the conversation required and said, "You have people out here before? You look familiar." I told him no. That wasn't quite a lie. I hadn't been out here as an adult, not with a face he could have seen. But something in his voice made the hair go up on my arms, a low-grade recognition I couldn't source, and I didn't ask him to clarify, and he didn't offer. We hiked up to the lookout. It was fine. It was beautiful, actually. You can see an enormous distance from up there, ridge lines rolling out in every direction, and for about 40 minutes, I managed to just be a guy on vacation with his wife and his friend, looking at a nice view. Then, on the way back down, Marcus stopped on the trail and asked if either of us had noticed the old road. I hadn't. He pointed it out, a break in the trees below the switchbacks, a suggestion of grated earth under 15 years of grown-in brush, running off from the main trail toward a fold in the hillside that the modern trail didn't touch. Old roads aren't unusual out there. The hills are full of decommissioned logging tracks and fire roads from the CCC era. But Marcus, who has never in the years I've known him shown 1 ounce of interest in unmarked trails, said he wanted to see where it went. I said maybe another day. I don't know why I said that. Some instinct, maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to get back to the RV before dark. Dana agreed with me, and Marcus let it go easily enough, and we hiked out. That was the last entirely normal day. On day 4, Marcus was gone when I woke up. This wasn't immediately alarming. He was an early riser, and there was a coffee thermos missing from the counter, so my first assumption was that he'd walked down to the camp store or out toward the creek. Dana wasn't worried either, not at first. We ate breakfast. We did a load of laundry at the campground's coin machines. By 11, when he still hadn't come back and wasn't answering his phone, no signal, the screen said, which tracked. Cell service in that loop was spotty at best. Dana's face started doing the thing it does when her calm is a decision rather than a feeling. We asked around the loop. The couple in the truck camper at 32 hadn't seen him. The camp host, a retired guy named Pete who drove a golf cart around emptying trash cans, said he'd seen one of your group walking off toward the tree line behind our site sometime before 7, alone, moving with purpose, like he knew where he was going. Pete didn't think much of it. People wander off from campgrounds constantly, he said. Day hikers, photographers chasing the morning light. I want to be honest about the next several hours, because I think what I felt was more useful in hindsight than what I did. What I did was reasonable. We waited. We walked the nearby trails calling his name. We told Pete, who told a ranger, who logged it as a possible missing hiker, and said the standard search window was still hours away since Marcus was an adult, who'd been gone less than a day. What I felt, underneath the reasonable worry, was something closer to recognition. An old, familiar shape settling back over me. The specific quality of afternoon light and helpless waiting that I remembered from 2009. From a search command post outside Sturgis. From my mother sitting in a folding chair not moving for 6 hours. I hated how known it felt. I hated that some sick, distant part of my brain had been braced for this exact feeling since we'd crossed into the park. Ostrander showed up around 3, along with a younger ranger and 2 volunteers from the visitor center. They took a description, asked when Marcus was last seen, and this stuck with me, whether he had shown any unusual interest in areas outside the marked trail system in the days prior. I told them about the old road he'd pointed out on the Coolidge hike. Ostrander's jaw did something almost imperceptible. A small tightening, and he said they'd check that drainage. Marcus walked back into camp at 6:40 that evening, on his own, from the direction of the tree line behind Site 31. Not from any trail. Not from any direction that connected to a parking area or road. He was not injured, not obviously. He was calm, in a way that read, at first, as relief. And it took me almost a full minute of looking at him to understand that what I was seeing wasn't relief at all. He said he'd gone for a walk, lost track of the time, followed a game trail further than he meant to, gotten turned around, found his way back once the light started slanting. It's a plausible story. People tell versions of that story in national parks every single day. What made it not plausible, in the moment, in a way I couldn't have articulated to the ranger standing next to me, was the way Marcus told it. Flat, unhurried, without a single beat of the embarrassment or adrenaline crash you'd expect from someone who just spent 11 hours lost in bear country. He apologized for worrying us in the tone you'd use to apologize for being late to dinner. Dana hugged him. I noticed he didn't quite hug back the way he used to, one arm coming up a half-second slow, like he was recalling the motion rather than performing it. The Rangers took a brief statement and left, satisfied enough, though Ostrander held my eye again on his way out and said, "Glad that one's got a good ending," in a tone that didn't sound glad at all. That night, cleaning a scrape on Marcus's forearm that he said he'd gotten from brush, Dana found something else. 3 small, precise punctures in a straight line just below his elbow, evenly spaced, maybe a centimeter apart. The skin around them not torn or bruised the way you'd expect from briars or a fall. Just clean, small, deliberate-looking holes that had already mostly closed. Marcus looked down at them like he was seeing them for the first time, and said he didn't know what they were from. He didn't seem bothered. That was the part that bothered me. He went to bed early. Dana and I sat outside by a fire that, again, took a long time to catch and burned, again, with that thin blue edge low in the flame, and she asked me very quietly if I thought Marcus was okay. I said I didn't know. That was the truth. Across the loop, Site 14's light was on. I watched it flicker once, the way a bulb flickers when something briefly crosses in front of it, though there was no shape at the window, no silhouette, nothing I could point to and call a person. Just the light, dimming and returning, on no rhythm I could find a pattern in. I didn't sleep well that night, and around 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of the RV's side door, the soft click of the interior latch, not the loud clunk of it opening. I lay there for a long moment, convincing myself I'd dreamed it, and then I got up and checked, and the door was unlocked, though I was certain I'd locked it before bed, a habit so old I do it without thinking, the same way I check a stove. Marcus's bunk, the fold-out dinette bed at the front of the rig, was empty. I found him outside, standing at the edge of our site, facing the tree line, not moving, his bare feet in the gravel. When I said his name, he turned around without any of the startle a person has when they're pulled out of sleepwalking. His eyes were open and steady. He said, "I heard Danny. I want to be precise about what that did to me, because I think it's the hinge the rest of this story turns on. I had not told Marcus my brother's name on this trip. I had told him years earlier, in the vague way you tell a friend about an old family tragedy. My brother went missing camping when I was in college. They never found him. But I am certain as I can be about anything from that week, that I had never once said the name Danny out loud in front of Marcus during those 5 days in Custer State Park. I asked him what he meant. He said it like it should have been obvious, that he'd heard someone calling out past the fence line, a voice he somehow knew was my brother's even though he'd never met him, never heard a recording of him, had no earthly way of knowing what Danny Brooks's voice sounded like at 17. He said it without distress. He said it the way you'd report a fact you'd looked up. I got him back inside. Dana woke up while I was doing it, and the 2 of us sat with him at the little dinette table with the lights on until he seemed to come back to himself, blinking more, apologizing again in that same flat, borrowed-sounding way, saying he must have been sleepwalking, that he sometimes did that under stress, which, I checked with Dana later, quietly, was not true. Marcus did not have a history of sleepwalking, not one either of us had ever heard about, not in 15 years of friendship. None of us slept the rest of that night. Around 5, gray light starting to come up through the pines, I looked out the small window over the dinette and saw, at the edge of Site 14, a shape. I'll call it a shape because I genuinely cannot tell you with confidence that it was a person, though it had the general proportions of one, standing very still near the back corner of that empty but not empty trailer. It did not move the whole time I watched it, maybe 40 seconds, and then a truck pulled out of a sight 2 loops over, and its headlights swept the row, and when the light passed over that corner, there was nothing there. I didn't tell Dana. I don't fully know why. I think by then, some part of me had stopped wanting to compare notes on what was real, because comparing notes was making it more real, and I wasn't ready for that yet. I did, later that morning, walk over to Site 14 myself, alone, while Dana was in the bathhouse and Marcus was still asleep. I want to record what I found there because I think it matters, even though nothing about it would hold up as evidence to anyone. The fifth wheel's door was closed but not latched, swinging maybe an inch with the breeze, the kind of not quite shut that makes you feel obligated to either close it all the way or check inside, and I am not proud of choosing the second option. I called out first. "Hello, anybody home?" the things you say, and got nothing back, and pushed the door open onto a single step and a narrow galley kitchen that looked, at first glance, entirely unremarkable. Faded curtains, a dinette table with a checkered cloth, a calendar on the wall, the kind campgrounds sometimes leave in older rental units, open to a month. I didn't check closely enough at the time and have regretted not checking since. What stopped me was the flat, stale closeness of a space that had been shut up and unaired for a very long time, even though Ostrander had told us the reservation issue was recent, a matter of days, not years. On the counter, next to an unplugged coffee maker, sat a single mug, and inside the mug, dried into a ring at the bottom, was coffee residue built up in layers, the kind that takes seasons to form, not a week. I left without going further into the trailer. I told myself, walking back across the loop road, that it didn't mean anything specific, that RVs sit unused for all kinds of reasons, that I was constructing a pattern out of things that didn't actually connect. I have not been able to make myself believe that since. On day 5, I made the decision that I think, more than anything else, I have to answer for. I told Dana and Marcus I wanted to hike up toward Coolidge again and find the old road Marcus had spotted 3 days before. I framed it as curiosity, a nice walk, a thing to do with our last full day in the park. That was a lie, or at least an incomplete truth. What I actually wanted, in a way I could barely admit to myself, was to walk into whatever this was instead of away from it. To find out if the old road led somewhere connected to Danny, to the search grid, to some explanation, even a terrible one, that would finally close a door that had been standing open in me for 15 years. I had a brother lost in these hills and a friend who'd started hearing his voice. And instead of packing up the RV and driving to the nearest town with a Best Western, I asked the 2 people I loved most to follow me deeper into it. Dana didn't want to go. She said so plainly, standing by the picnic table, arms crossed, and she was right. And I overrode her anyway, gently, the way you override someone when you've already decided and you're just managing their consent rather than actually asking for it. I told her we'd turn back at the first sign of anything wrong. I believed that when I said it. I don't think it was true even then. Marcus wanted to go. That was its own kind of wrong. Marcus, who 2 nights before had wandered out of the RV barefoot to listen for a dead boy's voice, was now eager, almost pleasant about it, packing water bottles with a competence that didn't match the blankness still sitting behind his eyes. We found the old road easily enough this time, since Marcus led us to it without hesitation, without checking a map, walking a line through unmarked forest like he'd walked it before. It ran downslope from the main trail into a fold of the hillside the park brochures don't mention. Graded earth still faintly visible under decades of pine duff and grown-in scrub oak, wide enough that I understood, walking it, that it had once been built for vehicles, a fire road or a service road, something with a purpose that had been deliberately allowed to disappear. My phone had no signal at all past a certain point, not spotty, just gone, the little icon reading SOS only. The GPS app, when I opened it out of habit, showed the blue dot sitting on a blank gray field with no roads or contour lines at all, as if we'd walked off the edge of every map that had ever been made of that hillside. I showed it to Dana. She didn't say anything. Her face had gone into the stillness she gets when she's frightened and refuses to let the fear slow her down. We walked for what felt like 40 minutes and should have covered, by any normal accounting, over a mile of ground. When we came out of the trees, the light had changed. Not dramatically, but enough that all 3 of us noticed at once. the particular gold slant of late afternoon sun, where, by my watch, it should still have been early. Dana checked her own watch. It agreed with mine. 2:47 in the afternoon. The sky did not agree with either of them. I don't have an explanation for that. I'm not going to pretend I do. The road ended at a clearing, and in the clearing was a building. It was a Forest Service-style structure, single-story, board and batten siding gone gray, a stovepipe chimney, a small covered porch with 2 support posts, the kind of ranger cabin or guard station you can still find scattered through public land out west. Most of them decommissioned decades ago, some maintained as historic sites, most just quietly rotting back into the hillside. This one had a sign bolted beside the door, weathered but legible. French Creek Guard Station, and below that smaller, a service number and the initials USFS. I want to be clear that I had looked, obsessively, at every map available of that search area in the weeks after Danny disappeared, and in the years since, on the rare occasions I let myself go down that particular hole online at 2 in the morning. There is no French Creek Guard Station on any Forest Service map of that district, historic or current. I checked again after we got home. It does not exist. It was standing in front of me anyway. Dana wanted to turn back right there, at the tree line, before we'd taken a single step into the clearing. I remember her hand on my arm, her voice very level, saying my name once, just Tyler, in a tone that was doing all the arguing the actual words weren't. I should have listened to her. I've replayed that moment more than any other single moment of the trip. That one instant where a different choice was still available and I chose wrong. Marcus was already walking toward the porch. Before we went in, I made myself do one practical thing, because some habit of mind was still trying to keep this ordinary. I took a photo of the building on my phone, meaning to send it to Dana's brother later and ask if he recognized the structure from any old Forest Service records, since he'd done wildland work in his 20s. When I checked the photo afterward on the drive to the hospital, the building was there in the frame, correctly placed, correctly lit. But the porch, which I would have sworn had 2 support posts holding up the roof line, showed only one in the photograph. The second post simply absent. The roof somehow unsupported and level anyway. And I have looked at that photograph more times than is good for me, and it has never once resolved into something that makes structural sense. The door wasn't locked. Inside was a single room, dim, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something mineral underneath it that I couldn't place. I'm trying to describe this plainly, without dressing it up, because dressing it up is exactly what I don't trust about my own memory of it. There was a cot along one wall, a small wood stove, a table with a logbook open on it, the kind of bound ledger ranger stations used to keep for weather observations and visitor traffic, decades before anyone digitized that kind of record. There was also, on a shelf above the stove, a row of small carved figures, maybe a dozen of them, whittled from what looked like pine, each one roughly human in shape but featureless, no faces cut into any of them, worn smooth in places the way an object gets from years of being handled by the same hands. I counted them without meaning to. There were 11. I don't know why that number has stayed with me the way it has, except that it felt, standing there, like a number that meant something specific to someone, a tally kept for a reason I did not want explained to me. The logbook's early entries in faded pencil were dated 1961 through 1987, routine weather notes, fire watch reports, the occasional line about hikers checked in or supplies restocked. The handwriting stayed consistent the entire time, which struck me even before I understood why it should have struck me. 26 years of entries in the same hand, no gaps, no change in the pencil pressure or letter forms you'd expect from one ranger retiring and another taking over. The last dated entry in that older hand was August 14th, 1987. It said, in full, "They don't rotate out anymore. It keeps the ones it likes." After that entry, the handwriting changed, and the dates stopped being consistent with any calendar I could reconstruct. Some entries dated only by season, some by phrases like "third light after the frost," and interspersed among those, entries that named specific years decades apart, 1994, 2003, 2009. I found the 2009 entry with my own hands shaking so badly I had to hold the book against the table to read it. It said, "Boy from the Scout Group 17, stayed 3 nights, asked for his brother, told him the brother would come." I'm not going to try to explain that entry to you, because I can't explain it to myself. I can tell you that I made a sound I don't have a word for, and that Dana came to my side and read it over my shoulder and went very quiet, and that Marcus, behind us, said, in that same flat, borrowed voice, "He's still here, you know." And neither of us turned around fast enough. The last entry in the book, the very last one, at the bottom of a page otherwise blank, was dated with today's date. The actual calendar date we were standing there, September the whatever it was, written in a hand I did not recognize and have never been able to stop thinking about since. It said, 4 came up the road, 1 will stay. I turned around and Marcus was not looking at either of us. He was looking at the corner of the room, where there was nothing. An ordinary corner of board and batten wall meeting board and batten wall, and he was smiling at it. Not a strained smile, not a frightened one, but the specific, wide, untroubled smile of someone greeting a person they're glad to see. He said, conversationally, "It took him a long time to grow up in here." I asked him who he was talking to. He didn't answer me. He kept smiling at the empty corner, and something about the smile, I've thought about this more than anything else in my life since, and the closest I can come is that it was structurally correct and emotionally empty, like a smile assembled from a diagram rather than felt. Made every part of my body want to run before my mind had caught up to a reason. Dana grabbed my sleeve, hard, and said we needed to leave now. And I agree with her. I've never agreed with anything more in my life. But Marcus was between us and the door, and when I said his name and reached for his arm to pull him toward the exit, he turned his head toward me with a speed that didn't match anything human I've seen a body do, and the smile didn't change at all, and he said, in a voice that was Marcus's voice and also, underneath it, unmistakably, achingly, my brother's voice, and a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years and recognized anyway in my chest before my mind caught up. He said, "You always said you'd come back for me." Dana screamed something, I think my name. I don't fully remember the order of the next several seconds. What I remember clearly, the part I will never stop remembering clearly, is Marcus's hand closing around Dana's wrist as she tried to pull past him toward the door, and the sound that followed and the amount of blood, far more than a wrist should hold, spreading fast and dark across the floorboards of a room that shouldn't have existed on any map, in a building 15 years overdue for collapse, while a voice that had my dead brother's cadence laughed once from inside my best friend's throat. I am not going to describe the injury in more detail than that. I've written it down once, in full, for the therapist I see now, and I'm not doing it again. I'll say only that it was not survivable in the way a person understands survivable, and that I did not have time to process what I was looking at before my body did the only thing left for it to do, which was drag Dana, who was impossibly, unbelievably still able to move, still able to scream my name. Still alive in a way that made no anatomical sense and that I have chosen not to examine too closely since, because examining it too closely threatens to unmake the fact that she is alive. Through the door and off the porch and into the trees, running a direction I did not choose and could not have named, while behind us Marcus's voice, still smiling, called after us in that layered double register, my brother's cadence riding underneath my friend's, saying something I have never repeated to anyone and will not repeat here. I don't remember most of the run back. I remember gravel under my knees at some point, and Dana's blood on my hands and my shirt, more of it than I could account for given that she was somehow still upright, still moving, her wrist wrapped in a torn strip of my shirt that I don't remember tearing. I remember the tree line opening up ahead of us sooner than it should have. The whole walk in reverse taking what felt like 4 minutes instead of 40. My watch reading 2:52 when we broke out of the trees onto the maintained trail below the Coolidge lookout, 5 minutes after the time it had read when we entered the woods on the far side, as if the entire clearing, the guard station, the road, everything, had cost us no time at all, or had cost us a different kind of time that doesn't show up on a watch face. A day hiker found us on the trail and had a satellite communicator and called it in. I don't remember much of what I said to the paramedics who met us at the trailhead an hour later, except that I remember very clearly one of them asking where our third companion was. And I remember not having an answer that made any sense out loud, and I remember the look that passed between the paramedic and the ranger standing behind him. And the ranger was Ostrander, and he did not look surprised. Dana's wrist required 41 stitches and 2 days in a hospital in Rapid City. The surgeon who treated her told me in the hallway in a voice pitched carefully neutral that the wound pattern was consistent with an animal bite, likely canine, possibly coyote, and that we were lucky it hadn't hit the artery. I did not correct him. I have never corrected anyone about what actually happened in that room, because there is no version of the true story that keeps me out of a psychiatric hold, and because more than that, I am not entirely certain, lying awake at 3 a.m. most nights since, that the surgeon's version isn't the one I should choose to believe. Search and rescue went back into that section of forest the next day, with dogs with a helicopter, retracing the route as best I could describe it, which was not very well, since I could not, standing at the trailhead in daylight with 3 rangers and a topo map, locate the old road at all. It was not where I remembered it being. There was no clearing. There was no guard station. Ostrander walked the described area himself twice and told me, not unkindly, that there was no structure of any kind matching my description anywhere in that drainage, current, or historic, and that the Forest Service had no record of a French Creek guard station ever existing under that name. They searched for 4 days. They found no trace of Marcus. No gear, no clothing, no remains, nothing. His case is technically still open. It has been 11 months. I asked Ostrander before we left the park for good why he'd looked at me the way he had that first day, told me I looked familiar. He was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer, and then he said he'd worked that district for going on 22 years, and that every so often, not every year, not on any schedule he'd ever been able to pin down, somebody comes through the campground asking about an old road, or hearing something they shouldn't be able to hear, or losing someone who comes back not quite right, and that the department doesn't have a form for it, and that the previous district ranger, before he retired, told him the same thing his own predecessor had told him, which was to log it, keep the family's contact information current in case something eventually turns up, and never, under any circumstances, walk that ground himself after dark. He said he was sorry. He said it in a way that made clear the apology wasn't for anything he'd personally done, but for something much older than his tenure, something he'd simply inherited the weight of, the way a house inherits a settling crack in its foundation from whoever built it wrong the first time. I asked him directly if he thought my brother was still out there, in whatever way out there could mean, given everything I'd seen. He didn't answer that one at all. He shook my hand, told us to drive safe, and walked back to his truck. And that was the last conversation I had with anyone in an official capacity about what happened to us in Custer State Park. Dana and I don't talk about that week much anymore, not directly. We've built a kind of careful architecture around it in our marriage. Subjects we approach sideways, sentences we let trail off, a shared understanding that some silences are load-bearing and shouldn't be tested. She still checks that our doors are locked twice before bed, a habit she picked up that September and has never dropped. She still, on the rare occasions we've camped since, insists on a site with other families close by on both sides, no exceptions, and I've never once argued with her about it. I want to end this honestly, which means I can't end it neatly. We drove the RV back to Rapid City the day Dana was discharged and flew home from there, leaving the rest of the trip unfinished. I have not been back to South Dakota. I don't think I can go back. Dana's wrist healed as well as 41 stitches heal, which is to say there's a scar she doesn't talk about and I don't ask about, curved in a way that doesn't quite match a normal bite pattern if you look at it straight on, though we've never said that to each other out loud. Some things you can share a room with without agreeing to name. Marcus's mother called me twice in the first month, asking questions I had no honest way to answer. Whether he'd seemed himself, whether we'd argued, whether there was any chance at all that he'd simply walked off on purpose, started a new life somewhere. The kind of story families tell themselves because the alternative is unbearable. I told her he'd seemed tired. I told her the trail was more remote than we'd realized, and that he must have gotten turned around. Both of those things were technically true, in the narrowest possible sense, and I have never been able to decide whether saying them to her makes me a liar, or simply a man protecting a grieving mother from something that wouldn't have helped her carry the weight any better for being accurate. Marcus's family held a service 8 months after, the kind of service you hold for someone who is legally missing rather than confirmed dead, which is its own particular unbearable ceremony. I stood in the back. I didn't speak. I don't think I could have gotten through a sentence about him without either lying or saying something that would have made his mother's face do the thing I've spent my whole life trying not to watch happen to people I love. Here's the part I haven't told anyone. Not Dana, not my therapist, not my mother. 2 months ago, a padded envelope arrived at our house with no return address, postmarked from a town in western South Dakota I'd never heard of. Inside was a single photograph, old, the kind with a white border and a date stamp in orange along the bottom edge. AUG 1987. It showed the front porch of a board and batten cabin, 2 support posts, a sign beside the door too small in the frame to read clearly, though I didn't need to read it. Standing on the porch in a ranger's uniform was a young man I did not recognize. Standing next to him, half a step behind, smiling the way people smile in old photographs when someone's told them to say cheese, was a boy who looked exactly, precisely, unmistakably like my brother at 17. The same crooked front tooth, the same cowlick he used to hate, the same faded band t-shirt I remembered him actually owning. The date stamp reads 1987. Danny was born in 1992. I keep the photograph in a drawer I don't open very often. I haven't decided what it means or whether deciding is a thing I'm capable of doing safely. Some nights when I can't sleep, I think about the last line in that logbook, the one dated with the day we walked in. 4 came up the road, 1 will stay. And I do the arithmetic I've done 100 times since. The number of us who walked up that hillside against the number who walked back down. And it always comes out even, which is the part that frightens me more than anything else. 4 went up, 3 came down. If you count the way rescue counted us, Dana, myself, and 11 months later, still officially, on paper, Marcus, unresolved, neither found nor declared. 4 minus 1 who stayed equals 3. The math works. That's what I can't stop thinking about at 3 in the morning. The math works exactly the way the book said it would, and I have no way of knowing, none at all, whether that means Marcus is the one who stayed or whether it means the count was never really about him to begin with. Story 2. My name is Amanda Cole, and this happened at a campground outside Moab, Utah in the spring of last year. I want to say up front that I don't know what happened. I've turned it over enough times that I no longer trust my own account of it, which is probably the most honest thing I can tell you before I start. I'd just left my job at a title insurance office in Grand Junction, and about 6 weeks before that, my husband Paul had moved his things out of the house while I was at work, which is its own kind of cowardice I've made peace with mostly. I bought a 22-foot travel trailer off a guy in Frida who was upgrading to something bigger, and I decided I would just go live in it for a while because staying in the house felt like living inside a museum exhibit of my old life, and because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I brought my dog, a shepherd mix named Scout, who I'd had since he was a puppy and who Paul had never much liked, which in hindsight tells you something about Paul. I picked the campground because it had decent reviews and a monthly rate that worked for someone who wasn't sure how long she'd be staying anywhere. It sat off the highway on land that had probably been ranch land at some point, a gravel loop with maybe 40 sites. Half of them long-term residents in trailers that clearly hadn't moved in years, tires gone soft, skirting installed, little fenced yards with plastic chairs. The other half were transient, travelers passing through on their way to the parks, families with pop-up campers, retired couples in fifth wheels the size of my old house. There was a cinder block bathhouse, a small office that also sold ice and firewood, and a camp host named Russ who lived in a fifth wheel near the entrance and drove around in a golf cart checking on people. I want to be clear that nothing about the place looked wrong. I've thought about this a lot, trying to remember if there was some detail I missed on the first day, some crooked thing, and there wasn't. It was a normal RV park. The grass was patchy. There was a laundry room with 2 washers, one of which 8 quarters. Russ had a dog of his own, an old blue heeler with a graying face, and in the evenings you could hear kids on bicycles on the gravel loop and somebody's radio playing classic rock 2 sites down. I mention all this because I think it matters. I think the ordinariness of it is part of what made everything after feel so wrong, in a way that a haunted-looking place never would have. I parked in Site 14, which backed up to a stand of tamarisk and a dry wash that ran toward the river when it ran at all. Russ told me the wash flooded maybe twice a year, during monsoon season, and otherwise it was just a good windbreak. I hooked up my water and power, put out my 2 folding chairs and a rug I'd bought specifically because it made the gravel patch look a little more like a place I lived, and for the first 10 days or so, it was fine. Better than fine. I slept better than I had in months. Scout liked the space to run, liked the other dogs, liked an old golden retriever 3 sites over named Biscuit who belonged to a couple from Nebraska. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't think much of it at the time, was that Scout wouldn't settle at night the way he used to. He'd always been a dog who slept hard, who you practically had to shake awake in the mornings. At the campground, starting maybe the 2nd week, he started getting up in the middle of the night and standing at the foot of the bed looking toward the back wall of the trailer, the wall that faced the wash. He wouldn't bark. He'd just stand there, very still, with his ears up. And sometimes a low sound would come out of him that wasn't quite a growl, more like a hum with an edge to it. I'd tell him to lie down, and mostly he would, eventually, but he'd keep his head turned toward that wall. I assumed it was animals. It made sense. We backed up to a wash. There were mule deer that came through most evenings, and I'd seen coyotes scat on the trail behind the tamarisk. I told myself this so many times that first week that I stopped really examining it. A dog reacting to deer outside a trailer at night is about as unremarkable as things get. What I want to tell you about next is Dale. Dale lived 2 sites down, in a permanent trailer with an add-on porch built out of 2x4s and corrugated tin, the kind of structure that's been added to over years by someone with more time than carpentry skill. He was maybe 60, wiry, sunburned in a permanent way, and he'd lived at the campground, according to Russ, for almost 11 years. He kept mostly to himself. He had a small garden of potted plants on his porch that he watered obsessively, and a police scanner that crackled quietly most of the day, and he raised his hand to me the first time I walked past with Scout, but didn't say anything. We started talking maybe 2 weeks in when I was hauling my trash to the dumpster near his site, and he asked, out of nowhere, if my dog had been sleeping all right. I said something like, "Oh, he's been a little restless," and Dale nodded like this confirmed something for him. And then he didn't say anything else, and I felt too awkward to push it, so I said goodnight and walked back to my trailer. It was a strange enough exchange that I thought about it while I was falling asleep that night, turning it over, wondering if he'd meant anything by it, or if it was just an old man making conversation with a new neighbor about her dog. 2 nights later, Scout woke me up again, and this time he didn't stop at standing. He got up on the bed over me, which he never did, and he put himself between me and the back wall, and he growled. A real growl, low in his chest, sustained, the kind of sound I'd only heard from him once before, when a man had come to the door selling something and Scout hadn't liked him. I lay there for a long time with my hand on his back, feeling him rigid and coiled, and I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no animal, nothing outside that I could identify. Eventually he settled, but he didn't really sleep, and neither did I. In the morning I noticed something on the outside of the trailer, on the aluminum skin near the back window. A scuff mark about waist height, a smear that looked like it could have been made by an animal rubbing against the trailer, or a branch, or honestly nothing at all. Aluminum picks up marks from everything. I took a picture of it on my phone, which in hindsight seems like an odd thing to have done, except that some part of me already understood I might want documentation of something, even though I couldn't have told you what. I want to talk about the GPS thing next, because I've gone back and forth about whether it belongs in this story, or whether I'm just building a case for myself, assembling evidence after the fact to justify a fear that didn't need justifying. but it happened. So I'll tell it. About 3 weeks in, I drove into Moab for groceries, a 20-minute drive I'd made probably 6 times by then without any trouble. My phone's map, on the way back, took me a mile past my turn and then routed me down a BLM road I'd never been on, dirt and washboard, insisting I was 11 minutes from the campground when I knew for a fact I was going the wrong direction. I pulled over and looked at the map, and it showed my little blue dot sitting in the middle of a road that, according to the satellite image underneath it, didn't exist. Empty scrubland with no road drawn on it at all beneath my glowing route line. I turned the phone off and back on, and when it came back up, it had corrected itself, and the drive home from where I'd pulled over took exactly as long as it should have. I told myself it was a caching error, bad satellite reception out in the canyon country, which is a real thing that happens to everyone out there. I still think that's probably all it was. I only mention it because at the time it happened I felt a specific, focused unease that seemed disproportionate to a wrong turn, and I've learned to pay attention when my body reacts more than a situation seems to call for. That night I mentioned the growling to the couple from Nebraska, Carol and Jim, over their fire. Carol laughed and said their Golden did the same thing sometimes. Dogs get spooked by deer, don't overthink it. Jim said the wash behind our row was probably a game trail, that he'd seen deer tracks there most mornings. It was a reasonable, comforting conversation, and I went to bed that night feeling better than I had in days. I want to describe the shadow on the wall now, because it's the part of this I have the least confidence in, and also the part I can't stop thinking about. I woke up at some point that night. I didn't check the clock, though I would learn to start doing that later, because Scout was standing again, this time at the side window rather than the back wall, and there was a shape against the curtain. I want to be careful here. The window had a roller shade, not blackout curtains, and there was a security light on a pole near the bathhouse that threw a weak orange glow across our row most nights. So a shadow on that shade wasn't inherently strange. Branches did it. Other campers walking their dogs late did it. Russ doing his rounds did it. What was strange was that the shape didn't move like a person walking past, and it didn't move like a branch in wind because there wasn't any wind that night. I remember that specifically because the flag on Dale's porch had hung dead still all evening. The shape held mostly still, with a kind of small repeated shift to it side to side, low to the ground, for what felt like a long time but was probably under a minute. Scout didn't bark. He made that same humming growl, and he didn't move toward the window, which was unlike him. Normally, if he heard something outside, he'd go to the door wanting to get after it. This time he stayed by the bed, between me and the window, and he wouldn't look away from it. And I found that I didn't want to get up and look either, which is not like me. I've never been someone who's afraid of the dark or of noises at night. I grew up on a ranch. I know what animals sound like. I lay there and watched the shadow until it wasn't there anymore, and I didn't hear it leave. In the morning, I told myself several things in quick succession, the way you do when you're trying to out-argue your own memory. That I'd been half asleep. That shapes on a shade in weak light are notoriously hard to read. That I'd probably projected the stillness onto something that had in fact just been a large bird or a cat. I made coffee and took Scout for his morning walk down toward the wash, and that's when I found the boot prints. They weren't dramatic. I want to be honest about that. They were in the softer dirt near the base of the tamarisk, maybe 10 feet from my trailer's back wall, a few overlapping prints that could have belonged to Russ doing his rounds, or to Dale, or to any of a dozen people who walked that stretch. What bothered me wasn't the prints themselves. It was that they were close together in a tight cluster, like someone had stood in one spot for a while, shifting their weight rather than walking through. I mentioned it to Russ that afternoon, trying to sound more casual than I felt. He said probably kids. There were a couple of teenagers in the long-term row who cut through there sometimes on their way to the river, and he'd talk to their folks if it kept up. It was a good, plausible answer, and I accepted it. And I want you to understand that at every single point in this story, I had a good, plausible answer available to me, and I took it, because the alternative was a kind of fear I didn't have a category for. Dale caught me at the dumpster again a few days after that. He asked, again, how the dog was sleeping, and this time I asked him back. I said, Why do you keep asking me that?" And he looked at me for a second like he was deciding something, and then he said that when he'd first moved into the campground 11 years ago, the man who'd had his site before him had a dog too, a big one, and that the dog had stopped sleeping the same way mine had, and that the man had moved out about 2 months later, quick, middle of the night, left half his stuff, and Dale had never heard from him again, and Russ wouldn't talk about it. Then he said, real quick after that, like he wanted to walk it back, that it probably didn't mean anything. Campgrounds like this had a lot of people cycling through, folks left owing money or running from something all the time, and I shouldn't read into an old man's rambling. I want to tell you that I pushed him for more, but I didn't. I said goodnight, and I went back to my trailer, and I didn't sleep much. Here's where I have to admit something about myself that's relevant. In my marriage, toward the end, there were a lot of small things I noticed and explained away, one at a time, because each individual thing was explainable. And it was only in retrospect, after Paul had already moved his stuff out, that I could see the whole shape of it, the pattern that the individual excuses had been hiding. I bring this up because I recognized, even while it was happening at the campground, that I was doing the same thing, collecting small, explainable events and explaining each one, and refusing to look at the shape they made together, because I already knew from experience how much easier it is to live inside an explanation than inside the fear that the explanation is covering for. I called my sister Kim about a week after the conversation with Dale, mostly just to talk, and I told her some of it. The growling, the shadow, leaving out the part about Dale's story, because I already knew how it would sound out loud. She said it sounded like I needed more sleep and less time alone, and maybe I should come stay with her in Denver for a while. I told her I was fine. I believed it when I said it. Around this time, the campfire started giving me trouble, which is such a small thing that I debated whether to include it, except that it happened 4 nights running, and it had never happened before or since. I'd built fires in that pit a dozen times without issue, using the same firewood from the camp store, the same lighter, and starting on a Tuesday, it simply would not catch. The kindling would light, burn for a minute, and go out, over and over, even with no wind, even after I'd dried everything out and started over with fresh material. On the 4th night, I gave up on it entirely and sat outside without a fire, which felt worse somehow than not trying at all. Like the absence of that small orange light made the dark around the trailer feel closer than it had before. I think this is the part where I should tell you about the night Scout got out. It was a Thursday. I remember that because Russ did his trash pickup on Thursdays, and I remember thinking, distantly and uselessly, that I hoped he hadn't left the gate to the dumpster enclosure open, which was a stupid thing to be thinking about at 2 in the morning while my dog was gone. I'd gone to bed around 11 with Scout at the foot of the bed like always, and I woke because the trailer door was standing open. Not wide, just a few inches, enough for a dog to push through. And the latch, which required actual pressure to disengage, was undone. I want to be specific about this because I've asked myself 100 times whether I could have left it unlatched myself, and I don't think I did, because I remember checking it before bed, the way I'd started doing every night since the shadow. But I also know that memory is not reliable, especially at 2 in the morning, especially under stress, so I can't rule it out completely. Scout was gone. I called for him from the doorway, then walked the row calling his name, trying to keep my voice down out of some instinct not to wake the whole campground, which in hindsight seems like the wrong instinct to have had. Dale's porch light came on while I was out there, and he came down in a robe and slippers and helped me look, walking the wash with a flashlight while I checked between the trailers. Russ came out too in sweatpants, not annoyed, which told me something about how these things had been received here before. We found Scout about 40 minutes later, maybe 80 yards down the wash, past where the tamarisk thinned out into open scrub. He was sitting, not running, not distressed in any obvious physical way. No blood, no limp, nothing torn. Just sitting in the dirt facing back toward the campground, toward us, as though he'd been waiting. When I called him, he didn't come right away. He looked at me for a few seconds, the flashlight beam on him, and there was something in the way he held himself that I didn't like, a stillness that wasn't like him. And then he got up and trotted over and let me put my hands on him, and he seemed, at least physically, fine. Dale didn't say anything on the walk back. Russ said he was glad we'd found him. Said dogs get spooked and run sometimes. Deer or coyote scent. Nothing unusual about it. I thanked them both and went back inside and sat with Scout for a long time, running my hands over him, checking for ticks or cuts, finding nothing. And the whole time some part of my mind was trying to catalog exactly what was different about him because something was, even if I couldn't point to it. Over the next several days, I noticed the differences accumulate in small ways. He stopped sleeping at the foot of the bed and started sleeping by the door instead, facing it, which he'd never done. He wouldn't go near the back window at all, would actually walk around the long way to avoid passing close to it inside the trailer, which is a strange thing for a dog to learn to do intentionally. He stopped playing with Biscuit, the golden retriever 3 sites down, wouldn't even go over when Carol called him by name, which he'd always loved before. And there was a thing he started doing that I didn't have a word for at the time, and still don't exactly. He would sometimes, a few times a day, stop whatever he was doing and stare at a fixed point that had nothing in it. Not toward a sound or a smell that I could identify, just stare, for 10 or 15 seconds, completely still, and then shake himself off like a dog does after being wet and go back to normal. I told myself dogs get spooked and it takes time to get over it, same as people. I told myself this a lot. I want to tell you about the last week now, because I've been circling it, and I think I have to just say it plainly. It had been about 5 weeks total at the campground. I'd started without really admitting it to myself, sleeping with the lamp on, and I'd started checking the door latch 2 and 3 times before bed, and I'd noticed that I was avoiding walking Scout down toward the wash even in daylight, taking the long way around by the entrance road instead, which added 10 minutes to a walk that used to take 5. Carol asked if I was doing okay, said I looked tired, and I said I hadn't been sleeping great, which she took kindly, at face value. On a Tuesday night, close to midnight, I heard something outside that I could not explain away as an animal, and I want to describe it as precisely as I can without dressing it up. It was a sound like knuckles on the aluminum skin of the trailer. Not loud, 3 or 4 taps, then a pause, then 3 or 4 more, coming from the back wall, from roughly the height of the scuff mark I'd photographed weeks earlier. Scout, who'd been lying by the door, got up and came and stood beside my bed, pressed against my leg, and he was shaking. Actual visible trembling, which I had never seen him do, not during thunderstorms, not at the vet. Nothing had ever made that dog shake before. I did not get up and look. I want to be honest that I have never been more afraid in my life than I was lying in that bed listening to a sound I could not identify and choosing not to look at its source. And some part of me has never forgiven myself for that choice, even though I also believe, with equal conviction, that looking would have been the wrong choice, that whatever was outside wanted me to look, though I have no way to justify that belief with anything except the way my body felt at the time. The tapping stopped after maybe 2 minutes. I lay there with the lamp on and Scout pressed against me until it started to get light outside, and I did not sleep. In the morning, I went and looked at the back wall in daylight, and there was nothing there. No marks, no prints beneath the window, nothing to photograph. I remember standing there in the cool morning light feeling almost angry at the absence of evidence, like the lack of a mark was its own kind of taunt. I found Dale on his porch that morning and I told him about the tapping, and I asked him, straight out this time, what had happened to the man before him, the one with the dog. He was quiet for a while, watering a plant that didn't need watering, and then he told me that the man's name had been Wendell, that he'd lived in that same site, my site, Site 14, for almost 2 years before whatever happened, that his dog had started acting the way mine had, and that one night Russ had found Wendell's trailer door open and Wendell gone. No truck missing, no note, nothing packed except, oddly, his dog's leash and bowl, which had been sitting neatly by the door like he'd meant to take the dog somewhere and then hadn't. The dog itself had been found 2 days later, sitting in the wash, same as Scout, and had been given to a family passing through because nobody at the campground wanted to keep it, on account of how it had started acting. Dale wouldn't say more than that it had stopped acting like a normal dog, had started doing things that made people uncomfortable to be around. and eventually just stopped eating and had to be put down by the family that took it, only about 3 weeks after Wendell disappeared. I asked if anyone had reported Wendell missing. Dale said Russ had called it in, that a deputy had come out and looked around and taken a report, and that as far as he knew, nothing had ever come of it. No truck found, no body, no leads. The file probably still sitting open in a drawer somewhere in the county sheriff's office. He said this like it was a common enough kind of story out here. Men who came out to the desert running from something and eventually just kept running, past the point anyone could follow. I asked him why he'd never told me this before, and he said because it never does any good to scare a woman living alone in a trailer with a story like that. And he'd hoped, when he first noticed my dog acting strange, that it would pass, the way it sometimes did with other campers over the years. Dogs that got spooked for a week or two and then settled back down. He said this had happened before, more than once, in the 11 years he'd lived there, not always ending the way it had with Wendell. Most times the dog just calmed down eventually and nothing more came of it. But enough times, with enough of a pattern, that he'd started keeping half an eye on new arrivals who took Site 14, which had a way of cycling through people faster than the other sites. I asked him if he thought I should leave. He looked at me for a long moment and said that in his experience, the ones who left quick at the first sign always seemed to be fine afterward. It was the ones who stayed to figure it out that he worried about. I want to tell you I left that day. I didn't. I told myself I needed one more night to pack properly, to call the office about my monthly rate. Practical things that in hindsight were just excuses to avoid admitting how frightened I actually was. Because leaving abruptly would have meant admitting the fear was real, rather than something I could manage by being careful. That last night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up with the lamp on and Scout beside me, and around 1 in the morning the interior lights of the trailer, the overheads, not the lamp, which was plugged into a different outlet, flickered twice, and then went out entirely, and the little digital clock on my microwave reset to blinking zeros, which meant a full power interruption, though when I checked the breaker box outside with a flashlight, everything was in the correct position. Nothing tripped. Russ's site, when I looked, still had lights on. Only mine had gone dark. I stood outside my trailer in the dark with a flashlight and my dog pressed against my leg, and I did not hear tapping this time. What I heard instead, from somewhere back in the wash past where we'd found Scout, was a sound I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone, including myself in memory. The closest I can get is that it sounded like breathing, slow and even, but with a depth and a duration to each breath that didn't match anything human, or, as far as I know, anything animal that lives in that part of Utah. It did not sound close. It also did not sound like it was moving away. I got Scout into the truck, not the trailer, the truck, and I drove to the office area near the entrance and sat there with the engine running and the doors locked until it started to get light, at which point I went and got Russ. Told him I was leaving that day. And he didn't ask why. And he didn't try to talk me into staying, and he refunded 3 days of my prepaid rate without me asking, which I've thought about since as its own kind of confirmation, though I have no way of knowing what it actually meant. I hitched up the trailer that morning with my hands shaking badly enough that it took me 3 tries to get the coupler latched, and I drove out of that campground and didn't look in my mirrors more than I had to. I want to tell you the story ends there with me driving away, but there are 2 more things I have to include, because I don't think I'm allowed to leave them out just because they're the parts I understand the least. The first is about Scout. In the years since, he has never fully gone back to being the dog he was before that campground. He's fine, physically. Good checkups, good energy most of the time, eats well. But he still won't sleep facing away from a door. He still does the staring thing sometimes. A few times a month now instead of a few times a day. Locking onto a point in a room that has nothing in it. Going still for 10 or 15 seconds and then shaking it off. And there is one specific thing that started only after that campground, and that I've never been able to explain. He will not, under any circumstances, get into an RV or a camping trailer of any kind. Friends have offered to let us use theirs for trips. He won't cross the threshold. He'll sit outside the door and shake. The same trembling I saw that last night until I stopped trying to make him go in. The The second thing is that about 4 months after I left, curiosity got the better of me, and I called the Grand County Sheriff's Office, gave them Wendell's approximate time frame and the campground's name, and asked if there was any record of a missing persons report matching that description. The woman I spoke with was polite and put me on hold for a while and came back and told me she couldn't find anything under that name in their system going back 15 years. I asked if she could check under other spellings, thinking maybe Dale had gotten it wrong, and she checked and found nothing there either. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if Dale's story was true and simply never made it into any system I could access, or embellished, or entirely invented by an old man who'd lived alone at a campground for 11 years and had his own reasons for wanting company in his fear. I've never gone back to ask him. I'm not sure I want an answer badly enough to drive back out there and find out whether he's even still living in that same trailer, at that same site, 2 doors down from mine. What I keep coming back to, when I try to make sense of any of this for myself, is not the tapping, or the shadow, or the sound in the wash. Though those are the parts that come back to me at night sometimes, usually when I'm somewhere unfamiliar and it's quiet. What I keep coming back to is the 40 minutes my dog was gone, and the way he was sitting when we found him facing the campground waiting, like something had walked him out there and set him down and told him to stay until we came. And I think about how easy it would have been for me to have slept through the whole thing. Door ajar, dog gone, and to have woken up in the morning simply believing he'd slipped his collar and run off chasing a deer, the way Carol's Golden had once done. A plausible story with no shape to it at all, and I think about how much of what happens to people in campgrounds and everywhere else probably gets absorbed into stories exactly that plausible, exactly that shapeless, by people who never had a reason to look any closer. I still have the trailer. I use it sometimes, for short trips, state parks mostly, places with other people close by. I've never gone back through Moab. I take the long way around now, even though it cost me an extra hour and a half because I don't like knowing how close I'd be passing to that gravel loop, and because I've never been able to decide whether the thing I'm avoiding is a place or a story, or something that was never really about the place at all, and might, for all I know, have simply been waiting to find a person like me. Someone already half convinced that the things closest to her could be explained away, no matter which campground I'd chosen that spring. Story 3. My name is Emily Carter. This happened over 5 days last September at an RV park outside Sula, Montana, in the Bitterroot Range, and I still don't have a clean way to explain any of it. I've told the story maybe 4 times since it happened, to my sister, to a therapist, to a park ranger who took notes and then told me, not unkindly, that there was nothing to file a report about. Every time I tell it, I leave something out, because some parts sound like I'm making excuses for things that don't need excuses, and other parts sound like I've lost my mind. I'm going to try to write it down in order this time, the way it actually happened, without smoothing it over. I should say first that Mark and I were not doing well before the trip. We'd been together 6 years, and 8 months before that September, we lost a pregnancy at 11 weeks, and neither of us had talked about it properly since. We went to one counseling appointment together and didn't go back. Mark dealt with it by working more. I dealt with it by making plans, trip itineraries, spreadsheets, packing lists, because a plan was something I could control when nothing else felt controllable. The RV trip was my idea. I'd rented a 24-foot Class C from a company out of Missoula, mapped a 10-day loop through the Bitterroots and down into Idaho, and told myself that if we could just get in a small space together for a week and not fight, we'd know we were going to be okay. We picked the campground because it wasn't on the loop I'd planned. That's the detail that still bothers me. We were supposed to be 40 minutes north, at a KOA with full hookups and a pool. But Mark missed the turn on Highway 93 while I was asleep, and by the time I woke up we were already on the gravel road. And there was a sign, hand-routed wood, reading, Broadwater Creek RV and Camp. Sites available, with an arrow pointing into the trees. Mark said we might as well stop, since I clearly needed the sleep and he didn't want to backtrack 40 minutes on a washboard road in the dark. I remember being annoyed about it. I remember thinking that was such a Mark thing to do. Decide something for both of us and present it after the decision was already made. I didn't know yet that it would end up mattering that we hadn't followed the plan. I should say more about why I was the one who fell asleep on the drive, because it matters for how little either of us questioned stopping somewhere unplanned. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. Some nights I lay awake doing math I didn't want to do, how far along I'd have been, what month, whether it would have been a summer or fall birthday. Mark didn't know I did that math. I never told him, the same way he never told me what he did with the hours he started spending at the office after 6. Hours that didn't produce any more work than he used to finish by 5. We were both keeping small private ledgers of grief and calling it normal life. So when I woke up in an RV and found we'd stopped somewhere I hadn't chosen, my irritation wasn't really about the detour. It was about one more thing happening to me instead of with me, which had become the general shape of that whole year. The campground had maybe 15 sites, gravel pads with electrical hookups, no pool, no Wi-Fi listed anywhere, a single building near the entrance that served as an office closed by the time we pulled in around 8. There was a payment box, an honor system, envelopes and a pen chained to a clipboard. Only 4 other rigs were parked when we arrived. I counted because I always count. It's a thing I do in new places, I don't know why. 2 were empty, seasonal looking, tarps over the tow hitches, clearly left for the season. 1 was a 5th wheel with a truck still attached, no lights on. And 1, 3 sites down from where we ended up, was an older Class A with a light on inside and a folding table set up outside with 2 chairs. We filled out an envelope for 4 nights, put cash in the box, and Mark backed us into Site 9. I remember the number because it was stenciled on a wooden post that had been split down one side, like something had hit it, and repainted over the crack instead of replaced. The first night was ordinary. We had dinner, we didn't fight, which felt like a small victory. Around 10, headlights walking, one of the older couples from the Class A came by to say hello, Roy and Gail, late 60s from Spokane, doing what Roy called the long way home, from visiting a daughter in Billings. Gail did most of the talking. She said they'd been at Broadwater a few days and liked it because it was quiet, and that the fishing on the creek behind the sites was decent if you didn't mind walking down to it in the morning before anyone else was up. Roy mostly nodded along and smiled and didn't say much, which I didn't think anything of at the time. Some people are just quiet. Gail told us the camp host, a man named Dale who lived in the building near the entrance, usually made rounds in the morning, but that we shouldn't worry if we didn't see him for a day or 2. He kept odd hours. She said it like it was a normal thing to say about a campground host, and I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say about a campground host. I asked Gail, mostly to make conversation, if they'd had any trouble finding the place since it wasn't well marked from the highway. She said no. They'd been coming to this stretch of the Bitterroots for years, though when I asked how many years exactly, she hesitated in a way that seemed odd for such a simple question, and said, "A while now," and looked at Roy, who didn't add anything. I noticed, without thinking much of it, that neither of them mentioned Broadwater by name, only this stretch, as if the name of the campground itself wasn't something either of them used out loud. Before they left, Gail said one more thing I wrote off completely at the time. She said, "If you're taking the loop road out to see the falls, go early. It gets confusing out there once the light starts changing." I asked what she meant by confusing, and she said something about how the road forked more than the map showed, and it was easy to end up somewhere you didn't mean to be. I said thanks for the tip. We'd keep it in mind, the way you say thanks to advice you have no intention of using. Mark and I went to bed a little after 11. I remember the RV being very quiet. No cars, no other campers moving around, nothing. Just the sound of the creek, faint, from somewhere behind the tree line. The next morning I woke up before Mark and stepped outside with coffee to look at the site in daylight. It was a nice-looking place, genuinely pine and larch. Granite outcrops up the hillside behind us, nothing that read as unusual. But I noticed the numbers on the site posts weren't sequential the way you'd expect. Ours was 9. The one to our left, closer to the entrance, was 14. The one past that was 6. I assumed it was just how the park had been laid out originally and expanded over time. Roads added in whatever order made sense to whoever built it 40 years ago. It's the kind of thing you notice and then forget within an hour, and I did forget it until it mattered again 3 days later. We spent that first full day doing what you do on a trip like this, a short hike up a trail Gail had recommended, groceries in Darby, back by early evening. Nothing happened. I want to be clear about that because I think it's important to the shape of the story, that the strange things didn't start on day 1. They started small on day 2, and they built. Day 2 is when we decided to drive out to see the falls Gail had mentioned. A place called Tin Cup Falls, according to the campground's paper trail map, about 11 miles up a Forest Service road that started at the north end of the loop. We left around 10 in the morning, later than Gail had suggested, because Mark wanted to finish his coffee and I wanted to shower. And in hindsight, I keep circling that hour we lost to nothing, wondering if it mattered. I was using 2 things to navigate. My phone, which had 1 bar of signal, and a Maps app that had already downloaded the offline area, and a paper map from the campground office that Dale, whom we still hadn't actually met, had apparently left in a plastic sleeve on the payment box for anyone to take. The paper map showed a single road in, forking once about 4 miles up, right fork to the falls, left fork looping back down to the highway. Simple enough. We drove maybe 6 miles. The road was exactly what you'd expect. Gravel, potholed in spots, climbing gently. Then we hit the fork. My phone showed us at the fork too, a small blue dot sitting right on the junction, and it agreed with the paper map. Right for the falls. We went right. About 2 miles past the fork, the road forked again. This wasn't on either map. Mark stopped the RV, carefully because it isn't a vehicle you stop carelessly on a narrow grade, and we sat there looking at the 2 options. Neither had a sign. My phone's blue dot was still moving along the single line the app expected us to be on, which meant one of 2 things. Either the app didn't know this second fork existed, or we weren't actually where the dot said we were. I remember feeling a very specific kind of irritation, the irritation of technology failing to match reality, rather than anything closer to fear. We took the fork that curved right, since that had worked the first time. 9 minutes later, I know it was 9 because I looked at the dash clock out of habit. We were back at the first fork, the one from the paper map, the one 4 miles up from the highway. Mark said we must have looped around on some kind of connector road, an old logging spur that fed back into itself, which happens in national forests. It's not unusual. I agreed, because it was a reasonable explanation, and I wanted a reasonable explanation. We picked right again, more carefully this time, both of us watching the road for any turnoff we might have missed. We didn't see one. We reached the second, unmapped fork again. We went left this time, deliberately testing it. 14 minutes later, we were back at the first fork again. Between the second and third attempts, sitting at that unmapped fork with the engine idling, I did something I'm not proud of. I opened the glove box and got out the rental agreement just to have something official looking in my hands. Some proof that we were where we were supposed to be, driving a real vehicle with a real VIN number on a real trip that had a beginning and an end written down on paper. I read the pickup and return dates twice. It didn't help with the road, but it helped with my breathing, which had gotten shallow enough that Mark noticed and asked if I was okay before I'd said anything. I want to be honest about what that felt like because I think if I only described the mechanical facts, the forks, the times, the recurring junction, it won't convey how quickly the mood in the RV changed. Mark's jaw did the thing it does when he's trying not to show he's rattled, this small clench that used to be one of the only tells I could read on him. I found myself checking the compass app on my phone and it agreed with the direction we should have been traveling both times, which made no sense if we'd actually circled back to the same point. According to the compass, going right at the second fork should have taken us further northeast, away from where we started, not back to it. We tried one more time, right fork, and this time Mark drove faster, like speed would break whatever pattern we were in. 6 minutes later, we were back at the first junction. He said out loud, "This isn't possible," which is not a thing Mark says. Mark is an engineer. He has an explanation for everything, usually one that makes me feel slightly stupid for having asked. Hearing him say something wasn't possible scared me more than the forks themselves did. We gave up on the falls and turned around, heading back down the way we'd originally come in, the 4 miles to the highway. That part of the drive was fine. No forks, no confusion. The paper map matched reality exactly the way it should have. It was only the loop above the second junction that had done something to us, or we had done something to ourselves. I genuinely don't know which framing is more accurate. Back at the campground that evening, we didn't talk about it much. I think we were both embarrassed in the way you're embarrassed after a moment of shared fear that resolves into nothing, like when you both jump at a sound that turns out to be the ice maker. Except this hadn't resolved into anything. We just stopped discussing it because there was nowhere for the conversation to go. We didn't call it what it was, not that night. Mark ran a diagnostic on his phone's GPS chip, blamed the terrain, the granite. The tree cover said mountain canyons can bounce satellite signal in ways that create phantom positioning. I let him talk. I wanted to believe an engineer's explanation more than I wanted to trust what I'd felt sitting at that junction 3 times in a row, watching the same bent sapling at the road's edge pass by us again and again, like it was the only thing in the forest that hadn't moved. I didn't tell him about the sapling. I didn't have a way to say it that didn't sound unhinged, and some part of me was already rationing what I said out loud, saving it. The way you save something you're not ready to hear back to yourself in another person's voice. That night, around midnight, I woke up because I heard someone walking outside. Footsteps on gravel, slow, circling. I looked out the small window over the bed and didn't see anyone, though our sight light wasn't strong enough to reach the tree line, so an absence of a visible person didn't mean much. I woke Mark up. He listened for a minute, said it was probably a deer, and went back to sleep. I stayed awake another hour. The footsteps didn't come back, or if they did, I'd fallen asleep by then. Day 3, I want to describe carefully, because this is the day that Roy went missing, or went away, whichever word turns out to be more accurate. We slept in. Around 11, Gail came by our site alone, which she hadn't done before, and asked if we'd seen Roy. She said he'd gone down to fish the creek that morning early before she was up and hadn't come back for lunch. She wasn't panicked, not yet. She said he sometimes lost track of time, but she asked if Mark would walk down to the creek with her to check, since it was a bit of a walk and her knees weren't what they used to be. Mark went. I stayed with Gail at the picnic table, and she talked, mostly about her and Roy's life. 41 years married, 3 kids. A lake house they'd sold 2 years ago that she regretted selling. She was warm and a little nervous and kept looking at the tree line while she talked. Mark came back after about 40 minutes, alone, and said he'd walked the creek in both directions from the access point and hadn't seen Roy or any sign of him. No tackle box, no folding chair, nothing. Gail's face did something I still think about. Not panic exactly. Something closer to recognition, like she'd expected this, like this was a possibility she'd already made peace with before it happened. She said very quietly, "He does this sometimes now." I asked what she meant, and she didn't really answer, just said they should probably tell Dale, the camp host, and walked off toward the office building. I want to note something here that I didn't think much of at the time. Gail said now. He does this sometimes now, as though it were a new thing. As though there had been a before, when he didn't, and something had changed. While we waited for Roy, I asked Gail more about their trip, partly to keep her calm, and partly because I wanted to understand how 2 people ended up parked at a campground that seemed to run on its own private logic. She told me they'd started coming through the Bitterroots 11 years ago, after Roy retired from a rail yard job in Spokane, and that the first few years they'd stayed at the KOA up the highway, the one we were originally supposed to be at. She said they switched to Broadwater sometime after that because it was quieter, cheaper, and because Roy liked the fishing, though when I asked her to pin down the year they switched, she couldn't, and laughed it off as her memory getting worse with age. I didn't laugh with her, something about the way she reached for a year and came up with nothing at all. Not even a wrong guess. Sat wrong with me for the rest of the afternoon. Before Dale, I want to describe the walk down to the creek that Mark and I took separately, later that afternoon after Gail had gone to find him. I went a different direction than Mark had gone that morning, further along the bank, past where the access trail petered out into unmarked brush. I found a folding fishing chair, aluminum frame, canvas seat, sitting upright in about 6 inches of water at the edge of the creek. No one near it, no tackle box, no rod. It was Roy's chair. Gail had described it to us earlier, orange canvas. And I remember thinking at the time it was an odd, specific detail for her to include, orange canvas, as if she already suspected we'd need to identify it. I didn't move the chair. I don't know why. It felt like something that needed to stay exactly where it was until someone official said otherwise, though there was no official, anyone within an hour's drive who could get to it. I told Mark about the chair when I got back, and we agreed not to mention it to Gail unless she asked directly, because neither of us could think of a way to describe a chair sitting alone in running water that wouldn't make things worse for her before we had any better explanation to offer alongside it. Dale, when we finally saw him, a heavy-set man in his 50s, flannel, quiet in a way that read as either calm or checked out, I couldn't tell which, didn't seem especially alarmed either. He said people wander off the trails behind the sites more than you'd think, that the terrain up the hill looks gentler than it is, and that Roy would probably turn up by evening. He didn't offer to call anyone. There was no cell service to call anyone with anyway, not from the campground. You had to drive down toward the highway to get a signal, which felt like an important detail once I started really paying attention to how isolated we actually were. Roy came back a little after 6 that evening. I saw him walking up the camp road from the creek side, and I remember my first reaction was relief, followed almost immediately by something else, something I couldn't name yet. He was walking normally. He looked physically fine, no injury, clothes not torn or wet beyond what you'd expect from a day near a creek. But he was smiling. Not a normal smile. A held one. The kind your face does when someone tells you to say cheese and you've been holding it too long already. And he kept it up as he walked, as Gail ran to him as she asked him where he'd been as she checked him over with her hands on his arms like she was checking for a fever. He said he'd just been fishing. Gail said she'd checked the whole creek. He said he'd been fishing in a tone that didn't invite more questions, and the smile didn't move. That night, from our RV, we could hear Gail and Roy's voices. Not the words, just the tones, low and going back and forth for a long time. Gail's voice doing most of the work, asking things, and Roy's voice answering short and flat. Around 11, it went quiet. I remember Mark saying, "That's not our business," when I said we should check on them, and he was right, it wasn't, but I still wish I'd gone over. I slept badly again that third night, and somewhere in the gap between waking and not quite waking, I thought I heard 2 voices outside instead of one. Roy's flat tone and something underneath it, lower, that didn't sound like Gail's at all, more like a second half of Roy's own voice speaking at the same time he was, a half second behind, like an echo that had learned to talk on its own. I've never been sure whether I actually heard that or built it afterward out of the fear the day had already put in me. I didn't get out of bed to check. That's the part I keep returning to when I can't sleep now. That I had a choice to go look, and instead I lay still and told myself it was nothing, because looking would have made it real, and not looking let me keep pretending for a few more hours that we were just tired people imagining things in an unfamiliar place. Day 4 is when things stopped being explainable in any way I've found satisfying since. We woke up and I went outside to make coffee on the little propane stove, and the sight looked wrong. I don't have a better word than that. Wrong. It took me a full minute to place why. Our folding chairs, which we'd left on the left side of the picnic table the night before, were on the right side. Our cooler, which I always latch, a habit from a bear country trip years earlier, so ingrained I don't even think about it anymore, was unlatched, lid slightly open, though nothing appeared to be missing from inside it. And the fire ring, which we hadn't used at all, had ash in it. Not much. A thin gray scatter, like something small had burned and gone out. I called Mark outside, and he looked at all of it and offered the same kind of explanations he'd offered for the fork in the road. Raccoons for the cooler, wind for the chairs, though I pointed out there'd been no wind that night and he didn't have anything for the fire ring, so he just didn't address it. I crouched by the fire ring for a while, longer than I should have, turning the ash over with a stick, trying to find something in it that would explain itself. A bit of foil, a cigarette filter, anything ordinary. There was nothing ordinary in it. Just fine gray ash, cold, with no charred wood underneath it at all, as if the ash had simply appeared as ash, without ever having been anything that burned. I didn't tell Mark that detail either. I was starting to understand, without deciding to, that I'd become the kind of person who filters what she says to her own partner, and that this was its own separate loss layered on top of everything else that trip was quietly costing us. We decided, without really discussing it as a decision, that we should leave a day early. I think we'd both arrived at the same conclusion independently and were relieved to find the other one there too. Mark went to start the RV's systems for travel, retracting the step, disconnecting the water and electric, while I went to settle up at the office, since we'd paid for 4 nights and were only staying 3. The office was locked, no lights on, no sign of Dale. I stood there a minute, then walked toward the entrance, thinking I might catch him on the main road. And that's when I noticed something about the site numbering that I hadn't put together before. I mentioned it earlier, 9, 14, 6, not in sequence. Standing at the entrance, looking back down the loop, I tried to count how many total sites there actually were, because Gail had said there were 15 or so and I'd counted 4 occupied rigs plus us on our first night. I counted the posts I could see from where I stood. There were more than 15. I want to say there were closer to 20, though I didn't get an exact count before I stopped myself. Because counting posts in a mostly empty campground at 8 in the morning while your chest tightens for no rational reason is not something you keep doing once you notice you're doing it. I also noticed, and this is the part I've second-guessed the most since, that a few of the posts I could see from the entrance had numbers I was fairly sure I hadn't seen on our first walk through the loop. An 11, a 3, a number that might have been 17 or might have been 12, hard to tell from that distance with the morning light flat against the paint. I told myself a campground this size wouldn't need that many sites, that I was misreading distances, that the posts closer to the tree line only looked like additional numbers because of how the light was falling on them. I've never been fully convinced by my own explanation, then or now. I went back to our site. Mark had the RV ready to go. As we were pulling out of Site 9, we passed Roy and Gail's Class A. Gail was sitting outside at the folding table alone, and she looked up at us as we passed, and I rolled down the window to say goodbye, to wish them well, something normal like that. She looked at me for a second too long before she said anything, and then she said, "You're leaving." Not a question, just flat. And then, "Good." And then quieter, almost to herself, "Try the south exit, not the way you came in." I asked what she meant, and she said the north road, the one that fed onto the highway near the falls turnoff, was not always there anymore, and that we should go out the south way instead, past the last row of sites, even though I hadn't seen a south exit on any map we'd been given. Mark thanked her, in the tone you use for someone you've quietly decided is not entirely well, and we drove on. I looked back once. Roy was standing at the edge of their site, near the tree line, not doing anything, just standing, facing the trees, and I couldn't see if he was still smiling because I couldn't see his face from that angle, and I've thought about that. The fact that I couldn't see his face, more than almost anything else that happened. We followed the loop road toward the entrance, the way we'd come in 3 days earlier. We reached the sign, Broadwater Creek RV and Camp, and the gravel road leading out to Highway 93, and everything felt normal, felt like relief, right up until the point, about a mile down that road where it forked. There was no fork on the way in. I am certain of that in the way you can only be certain of a handful of things in your life. We had driven that road once already, at night, tired, and I still remember it as a single unbroken gravel road from the highway to the campground entrance. Now there was a fork, unmarked, and the offline map on my phone showed our blue dot sitting on a road that, according to the map, didn't fork at all. Mark went left, since left seemed to trend toward where the highway should be. 11 minutes later, we were back at the campground entrance. The same sign, the same split post with the old crack painted over. We didn't say much. Mark turned around and tried right this time. 9 minutes later, the same sign again, I think this is the point where I stopped being able to hold on to the idea that there was a reasonable explanation coming. Not because of the road itself. I could still, technically, construct an explanation. Mountain roads do strange things. GPS can fail in canyon terrain. Maybe we were more disoriented than we realized. What broke something in me was smaller. On our third attempt, going right again, deliberately, watching every turn, we passed a mile marker. A small green reflective sign on a metal post, the kind the Forest Service uses. It read 9. We had not passed any mile markers on the drive in 3 days earlier. I would have noticed. I notice things like that. It's the same part of me that counts campsites. And even if there had been a marker I'd simply missed the first time, the number bothered me in a way I couldn't fully articulate until we were back at the campground entrance for the third time, and I saw, painted on the split fence post at the edge of the gravel lot, faded but still legible under the newer coat, the same numeral. 9. Mark wanted to try the south exit Gail had mentioned. I didn't want to go back into the campground at all, but the alternative was sitting at the entrance with a road that returned us to itself no matter which direction we chose. So we drove back down the loop, past our old site, which someone, or something, had already reoccupied. There was a small pop-up trailer there now, no vehicle attached to it, no one visible, that had not been there 20 minutes earlier when we'd left. We found the south exit. It wasn't on any map we had, but it was real. A narrower gravel track past the last row of sites, past number 6, curving south through denser trees. Gail was standing near its mouth, like she'd walked there to wait for us, which she couldn't have, because we'd left her sitting at her own site 15 minutes prior, and it would have taken longer than that to walk there on foot. She didn't say anything as we approached, just raised a hand, not quite a wave, more like an acknowledgement, and stepped back to let us pass. The south road did not loop. I want to say that clearly, because it's the one piece of the story with something like a resolution. We drove maybe 2 miles, and it fed onto a paved county road that our phones both recognized immediately. Full signal returning in a rush of notification sounds that felt almost violent after 3 days without them. We pulled onto Highway 93 south of Darby, roughly 9 miles from where the entrance road should have put us. On the wrong side of town relative to where we'd actually driven in from. We should have just kept driving. That's the part I go back to. We had a way out, it worked, and we didn't take it fully, because Markham and I understood this even as I was furious about it. Didn't want to leave Roy and Gail there without saying something to someone, a ranger station, anyone official, about a man who'd gone missing for most of a day and come back different. We stopped in Darby, found a diner with a payphone bolted to the wall outside, an actual payphone, which felt like a detail from another decade, and Mark called the county sheriff's non-emergency line while I sat in the RV with the doors locked, which I know doesn't make sense. Locking the doors of a vehicle in a sunlit gravel lot in the middle of a small Montana town. But it's what I did. The sheriff's office said someone would look into it. Mark came back to the RV and said the dispatcher had asked him to spell Broadwater 3 times, and then said she didn't have a campground by that name listed for that county, only a Broadwater Creek that was unincorporated forest land. No developed camping facility on record. Mark had argued with her for a minute, said we'd just spent 3 nights there, paid cash into an honor box, met other campers. She'd said she'd note it down and someone would check when they had a unit free. We drove another hour before either of us said anything real. I remember Mark's hands on the wheel, and I remember thinking his knuckles looked wrong somehow, and then realizing it was just that he was gripping too hard. Nothing more mysterious than tension. We agreed we would not go back. We agreed on that firmly, both of us, out loud, like saying it made it a binding thing. That night we stayed at a proper campground outside Hamilton, full hookups, other families around us, kids on bikes, normal noise. I slept for maybe 2 hours total. Mark slept better than I did, or seemed to, and in the morning he was different in a way I noticed but told myself I was imagining, because I wanted so badly for the previous 3 days to be over and explainable and behind us. The difference was small. He made coffee the way I make coffee, not the way he makes coffee. He's always used too much water, and that morning he measured it exactly the way I do, without asking, without me telling him. And when I pointed it out, half joking, he said he'd always made it that way, which wasn't true, and I let it go because arguing about coffee felt insane given everything else. At breakfast, he told a story about his father, a fishing trip when Mark was a kid, that I'd heard before, several times over 6 years, except 2 details were different. In every previous telling, it was Mark's father who'd fallen in the river. That morning, Mark told it with himself as the one who fell in, laughing about it the same easy way. And when I said gently, "I thought that happened to your dad," he looked at me for a second with an expression I can only describe as recalibrating, like he was checking something against a reference before answering, and then he said, "No, that was me," with total confidence, and moved on to another subject. I told myself memory is unreliable, that people misremember their own family stories all the time, that grief and exhaustion do things to a person's recall. I mostly believed myself for the rest of that day, because the alternative wasn't something I had a place to put. We drove home 2 days early, cutting the trip short, returning the RV to the rental company in Missoula with an explanation about a family emergency that wasn't true. The woman at the counter did the walk-around inspection and paused at the door latch, the main entry door, and asked if we knew it had been forced at some point. There were fresh marks on the frame, scratches around the lock mechanism. Consistent, she said, with someone trying to get it open from the outside. Neither of us had noticed. Neither of us had heard anything, beyond the footsteps I'd woken to that first night and written off as a deer. That's most of it. I could stop there, and for a long time. When I told this story, I did stop there because the ending felt tidy enough. Strange trip, strange road. We got out. Some things about Mark still feel slightly off. But grief does that to people, doesn't it? And 8 months of unprocessed loss will make you both a little unrecognizable to each other in ways that have nothing to do with anything supernatural. But I want to include the last thing, because it's the reason I still haven't fully let this go, and it's the reason Mark and I don't live together anymore. Not because of a dramatic fight, just a quiet drift that started that September and never reversed. About 6 weeks after the trip, I was going through the RV's onboard system before we returned it. Mark had connected his phone to it for music on the drive, and I wanted to make sure we deleted our account information. And I found a folder of photos on the vehicle's built-in dashcam storage, the kind that record continuously and loop over old footage unless you save a clip. Most of it was road footage, useless, time-stamped across our whole trip. But there was one saved clip, 4 minutes long, time-stamped for day 3. The evening Roy came back from the creek. Neither of us remembered saving anything. The clip was from the dashcam's rear-facing interior camera, the one meant to monitor cargo or kids in the back, which we'd never turned on and didn't know had been recording. It showed the inside of the RV, dim, our things where we'd left them. Mark is in the frame for part of it, asleep on the bed the way he was that night. And for about 40 seconds, near the 2-minute mark, someone else is standing at the foot of the bed, not doing anything, just standing there, facing him. I can't make out a face in the footage. The resolution is bad and the lighting inside was low. But the shape of the figure is wrong for either Roy or Gail, too tall for Gail, wrong stance for Roy. And it isn't me because I know exactly where I was that night, awake in the front of the RV, listening for footsteps that never came back. The figure doesn't move for those 40 seconds. Then the footage cuts, the way saved clips do, to black. I never showed Mark the clip. I told myself it was because I didn't want to frighten him. But the real reason is that some part of me was afraid of how he'd react to seeing it. Not afraid he'd be scared, afraid he wouldn't be. I still have the file. I've watched it more times than I should admit. Every time I convince myself for a few seconds that I can make out the shape smiling, and then I convince myself I can't, that I'm doing what my mind does to blank spaces when it's been given nothing else to work with, and I close the laptop and I don't watch it again for a few months until I do. We never went back to Broadwater Creek. I looked it up online, once, about a year later, and found nothing. No listing, no reviews, no trace of a campground by that name in that county, which either means the sheriff's dispatcher was right and it never officially existed, or means something I'd rather not sit with for too long. I think about Gail sometimes, standing at the mouth of that south road, waiting for us in a place she couldn't have reached in time, saying good. And I think about Roy facing the tree line with his back to us. And I think about the way Mark says he fell in that river, with a certainty that never wavers no matter how many times I bring it up. And I think about the fact that he measures coffee the way I do now, exactly, every single time, and has for over a year. I don't have an ending for this. I know that's unsatisfying. I've tried to write one a few times, something with a clearer shape to it, but the truth is, I don't know what happened on that road, or in that campground, or to Roy, or possibly to Mark. And I don't know if the man I lived with for another 8 months after that trip was entirely the same man who drove us in. I know the coffee. I know the story about the river. I know a shape standing at the foot of a bed for 40 seconds that neither of us can account for. I know that some nights, usually when I can't sleep, I find myself checking that the front door is locked twice, then a third time, and I know that I still, more than a year later, will not drive on an unfamiliar gravel road after dark, if I can possibly avoid it, because I keep waiting to see a sign with a number 9 on it, in a place where no number should be. Mark and I split up gradually, the way I said, no single fight to point to. He moved out in June. He still measures coffee the way I do. I know because we still talk sometimes, out of some leftover habit of caring about each other that I don't think either of us knows how to fully let go of. And a few months ago, on the phone, he brought up the trip out of nowhere, something neither of us had mentioned in almost a year. He said he'd been having a recurring dream about standing at the foot of a bed, watching someone sleep, and that in the dream, he couldn't tell if the person sleeping was me or him. He laughed when he said it, the way you laugh at your own dream to make it sound less like what it actually felt like. I didn't laugh. I asked him, as carefully as I could, if he remembered anything else from that last night at the campground, anything he hadn't told me. There was a pause on the line, longer than a bad connection would explain, and then he said, in a voice that had the smallest catch in it, a catch I'd never once heard from him in 6 years together. I don't think I was the one sleeping. I didn't ask him what he meant. I don't think I want to know. I've kept the dashcam file on an external drive since, backed up twice in case something ever happens to the original, though I can't say what I think would happen to it, or why I feel the need to protect a 40-second clip of a shape I can't identify standing at the foot of a bed in a campground that officially doesn't exist. Some nights I think about deleting it and never do. I think, if I'm honest, I'm keeping it the way you keep a photograph of someone you're afraid you'll otherwise convince yourself you imagined.